Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of you in the online. Welcome to the book talk today. This book talk is organized by Faculty of Education in Hong Kong U and also Consortium for Higher Education Research in Asia of Hong Kong U's Faculty of Education. The co-organizer is also Asia Pacific Higher Education Research Partnership from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Today, we have a very special book talk. Our colleague, one of our colleagues, Professor Lili here, and also her three colleagues will speak today about their new book, Student Agency and Self-Formation in Higher Education. We have four speakers today, Dr. Yusuf Oldac from Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and Professor Simon Marginson from University of Oxford. He will speak by online. Thank you, Professor Marginson. And our Dr. Lili is here. She will also speak from this room. And last speaker will be Dr. Soyoung. She's a research fellow in the Global Higher Education Research in Oxford. Yes. Well, first of all, congratulations to the new book. And we so much looking forward to hearing about the book. Without further ado,
can everyone hear us? Okay, it seems like, oh, Simon cannot. Is there a voice problem there? He can, okay. So let me ask the organizers here, should I keep this screens on or closed? Maybe like this is better?
yes.
Okay, so the listeners, you're not visible now. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. It's an honor for us to be here. So today's talk will be about this recently published book. It's published like a few months ago, actually. It's titled Student Agency and Self-Formation in Higher Education. As my colleague Jisun already told us, this is a presentation at Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong, and in partnership with Shera, Scape at Hong Kong U, and AFER, which is I am part of Asia Pacific Higher Education Research Partnership, led by Professor Kahomo. So we are already introduced. I will start the talk to give you a brief introduction to the book. I'll also talk about the introduction chapter a bit. And also we have the physical copy here, 2 copies. Thank you, Lili, for bringing. So people can, have a look and share their ideas afterwards with us. So let me start. So the first thing I wanted to share with you is the core idea of the book. So I myself will not share my own chapters, etc., but I will give you a broad introduction to this book, and we'll talk a little bit about the introduction chapter. But then we will have 2 chapters we will delve into in more detail, basically. They are chosen specifically for today. So this book argues for positioning students at the center of higher education, drawing from concepts of student agency and self-formation. The book highlights that higher education has broader and more important purposes than what a neoliberal human capital approach would suggest, and explores how students exercise their agency and realize self-formation as inherently connected concepts throughout university education. Let me try coming here. So we provide disciplinary, cultural, and contextual diversity, as the chapters provide international perspectives to readers interested in higher education theories, policies, and practices. We have chapters from different contexts, like, for example, my chapter is data from Turkey. There's a chapter data from Vietnam, Australia, Korea, China, of course, and different parts of the world, UK as well. So if you're interested, those international perspectives could be good. So to introduce the book, I think I should start by defining the core concepts. What do we mean? What is meant by student agency, for example, in this book specifically? The concept acknowledges students as agential subjects and incorporates the aspects of general human agency and the distinct features specific to education. Generally, human agency refers to individuals' capacity and autonomy to act with their self-determined objectives in mind. Agency stems from human consciousness and critical thinking, which facilitate reflexive deliberations and actions in the forms of active engagement and negotiation with the environments, whether challenging or resourceful and facilitating. By the way, these definitions, I am giving them in a way that, to the extent that they do not limit the definitions in each chapter, because each chapter have a different angle on the same topic, right? They have their own perspective, but they still subscribe to this overarching definition. So student agency differs from general human agency, particularly because of the impact of education. On the one hand, education is believed to enhance student agency by fostering well-being, skill development, critical thinking, human capability, and thus freedom. On the other hand, the success of education depends on the presence of student agency, which is essential for initiating student engagement in the form of self-motivated, self-regulative, and self-reflective thinking and behaviors. So this connection with knowledge, for example, is a very important thing for us. Agency can be thought of in multiple aspects. It could be, for example, within the context of wider engagement with society, but at the same time, learning and constructing knowledge. And in the context of and we will talk more about this actually in the next presentation by Professor Marginson. He will talk about the antecedents of this theory. So while the manifestation of this concept varies from context to context, self-regulation primarily emphasizes the role of students as the masters of their educational experiences in higher education. They are active learners who shape their holistic development through active agency. That's what we want to highlight. So these concepts, they're not the only concepts talking about, the active side of students, but in this book, we wanted to highlight these because of specific reasons that we will highlight in the following chapters discussions as well. So here I wanted to read by a few sentences, and then we'll select two of them afterwards. Here's a link. Maybe this slide will be available afterwards. So this link will take you to table of contents of the book later. You can look at it. So at the very beginning of the book, you will see the introduction chapter, which is titled Students at the Heart of Higher Education. It's an introduction. I will talk a little bit about it more in a few minutes. It's written by the editors, which is myself, Lili here, and Soyoung Lee, who's joining us online. And then the book has three sections in it. The first section is about conceptualizing student self-formation in higher education. As you can see, it's here. In this first section, we focus on conceptual discussions. What is meant by self-formation, right? And how is it perceived? How it's in the academic studies research. The first one is by Simon Marginson. He will develop on this himself later. So I will not spend a lot of time on this. It's titled Antecedents of Student Self-Formation in Social Theory and Educational Philosophy. What do they tell us about structure and agency? The following one, we also selected this one for today as well. It's a comparative one, Agency and Student Development in Higher Education and Cross-Cultural and Cross-Disciplinary Exploration. So this paper is led by Lili here, and also by Soyoung Lee and myself. We are the authors of this. And then we have a conceptual paper about the mechanism of student agency in self-formation through knowledge engagement in higher education, written by Soyoung Lee. This will not be presented today, but it basically talks about the underlying mechanisms of how agency works in self-formation theory. We have presented this earlier in another seminar like a month ago. You're welcome to check it. It's in the Oxford CGHE webpage, and also welcome to read the chapter itself, basically. The second section of the book is about international higher education evidence. So the chapters in this are how student agency is seen, becomes visible in international higher education. So here you see the first one is titled student agency and becoming in international programs in Vietnamese universities. These are colleagues all from Vietnam, although Lingnan is based in Australia. Very good data, empirical data from international students studying in Vietnamese programs. And then the following is about employability, right? Conceptualizing employability agency of international graduates. You may ask, like, well, what's the point of, employability is a different topic. Well, our colleagues argue that there is also agency in it as well. Employability, especially in today's crazy world, is not an easy thing for graduates, for international students. So if you're interested in that topic and how it connects to the theme of our book, that chapter is for you. And then the next one is by our lovely colleague from Japan, Tokyo University, Kazuhiro Kudo. He wrote about the role of higher education institutions in fostering students' cosmopolitan agency and self-formation. So this is again intercultural engagements and the role of agency in it in international education. He calls this cosmopolitan agency. So again, if you're interested, a good chapter for you. And then the last section is linking student agency in higher education with the wider society. It is usually discussed in the literature that linking agency, the student's individual agency with the society, the larger society, is the hardest. And there are less evidence on it, although there are studies, of course. So that's why we thought this section is also very important. So we have two sections under this, two chapters. The first one is mine. It's titled The Civic Aspect of Student Self-Formation in International Higher Education, Apprenticeship in New Worldviews. So in this chapter, I have comparative data of Turkish students studying in multiple countries, 4 countries basically. And I look at how, when students go abroad for studying, they immerse themselves into a new context, right? They see a new civic values, civic environment. So how does that work? So I called this apprenticeship in new worldviews, and I highlighted how students' agency helped them negotiating this changes in their mind. There's a conceptual framework in it as well. If you're interested, that chapter is there as well. And lastly, new agency in doctoral Oxford University, and the other is in Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. They build on Professor Barnett's ecological approach in looking for spaces for agency in doctoral education. Again, very interesting if you're interested in the trajectories of doctoral education in higher education and how agency plays a role in it. So this is basically an overall overview of the chapters. How to get the book? Well, this is a little, sounds too like advertisement, but basically we're kind of talking about the book anyway, right? So this is the link if you want to get it, and you can ask your library to get it as well. So I guess the slides will be up on the web and you can see this link later. The book has already thousands of accesses to its landing page. A lot of people love it, but I heard some people also dislike it. They have their different opinions, but I think both are good because our point is to, get the discussion started and encourage. That's how academic scholarship works, I think. So our hope is that the book will benefit scholarship across disciplines and serve as a good source book for research interested in this topic. So I have a limited time, but I want to discuss a little about the first chapter as well. I'll just tell you what it includes, and then I will hand the floor to our colleagues. So the first chapter, which is titled Students at the Heart of Higher Education, an Introduction. This chapter includes a historical overview of higher learning. Students in higher learning have never been as narrowly defined as they tend to be in the last decades. That's one of the main arguments in this chapter. And what do we mean by narrow definitions, right? We have to specify. So I think a lot of you already know these because you already work on similar topics anyway. That in the last decades we see reducing students to consumers, right? They pay to get the degree, or income maximizers, or calculative self-beings, get the degree and increase the income, or passive information receivers. That's also the aspect looking into teaching and learning part. So In this book, we say students are more than this. And students has never been identified like this historically when you think of, like, for example, different civilizations, right? The Islamic, for example, higher education and teachings. Now, there were scholars moving around the world. Their purpose was not to maximize their incomes. The knowledge itself was there very important, and forming oneself was one of the main ideas. Learning that knowledge was seen as sacred. Or look at the, where we are, cynic civilizational traditions. And we already, Professor Marginson will discuss that a lot in the next session. But, learning, especially higher learning, was never like this. And that's one of the things discussed in the chapter. We also provide an overview of the literature are implied in the extensive theories and concepts of student development in higher education. So basically, we argue that these topics are already actually discussed, they are there, but they are not explicitly named this way. So everyone uses a different concept. And it's okay, but we have to highlight that these are important topics and they're already in the discussion actively. Then we discuss the emerging line of literature that engages with the agency and self-formation concepts more explicitly. You're all welcome to read this chapter. So, okay, now it's my time to hand over. Just a brief Islam report from the symposium we had in Lingnan University before this book actually launched. And as you can see, everyone wears masks. It was COVID time, yeah. But it was good. On the screen background, there were many international joiners as well. We're all thankful. So following this introduction, 2 chapters will be presented. We specifically chose them. The first one by Professor Soyoung. He will talk about the antecedents of student self-formation in social theory and educational philosophy. So we will be talking about this theory aspect, how this self-formation came to be, and he will give us more ideas. And then in the following one, Professor Lili and Dr. Soyoung, they will discuss agency and student development in higher education. And they will provide cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary exploration. So how it is like in a comparative perspective. So we believe all are important in giving important aspects. So you have just my contact details if you need to contact me. But let me just hand over the microphone to Simon Marginson. Hello, are you there?
Well, thank you, Yusuf, and hello, everyone.
Hello.
And congratulations to Yusuf, Lili, and Soyoung. It's really great to share in the work of this book. It opens up a new pathway for research on higher education. Now I'll start sharing. Can you see this?
Yes, you can see.
Excellent. Now, many will recall Gert Biester's 3 functions of education: qualification, socialization, subjectification. Socialization refers to the preparation of students as part of social, cultural, and political orders, including norms and values formed in education. In contrast, subjectification is less subordinating students to society. Subjectification concerns the individuating effects of education, whereby students become self-determining subjects. Any education worthy of its name, says Biester, should always contribute to processes of subjectification that allow those being educated to become more autonomous and independent in their thinking and acting. Now, this subjectification function, emerging student agency in higher education, can be understood as student self-formation through the development of agentic capabilities, not just autonomous, but in some respects independent. Grounded in the inner mental evolution of agency, students build their capacity to learn self-consciously and critically, to absorb and reinterpret the knowledge and values and behaviours that they see, to consciously conform or to partly or wholly reject what they are given and devise their own path. Now, my chapter in the book argues that the core elements of student self-formation are the autonomy of the learner, reflexive agency, and the will to learn. And what makes self-formation distinctive in higher education is two further aspects that are institution-specific. In classroom learning, students self-form through active engagement in knowledge. And students also self-form through relational social activities outside the classroom, in residences and student associations, in service work and volunteering, in cultural and political activities, and so on. Both kinds of higher education activity are open to empirical study, and Soyoung has conducted an extensive inquiry into academic self-formation through immersion in knowledge. Now, students in higher education are adults. They still need the support of teachers, who are the gateway to knowledge, but they are increasingly aware of themselves as autonomous persons with agency freedom, capable of self-directed and conscious action, who apply their will to their own objectives. The key to self-formation is conscious reflexivity, the continuing processes of critical self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-criticism, self-regulation. Reflexivity rests on the double coding of the self, a process that has long been recognized in philosophy. In Chinese civilization, it goes back to the Ming Dynasty, Neo-Confucianism at least. Margaret Archer refers to the inner conversation of all persons between their social selves and their private inner selves, where they reflect on their day-to-day experiences. This is what Archer calls the rich inner life of reflection upon reality in which we give shape to our lives. Now, my chapter of the book, as Yusuf said, reflects on the scholarship of this understanding of self-formation, its antecedents in social theory and educational philosophy and pedagogy, in Confucian self-cultivation, in self-forming practices in ancient Greece and Rome, as researched by Michel Foucault in his late period work, in the Bildung idea in German education, in Vygotsky's account of the development of agency, in Amartya Sen's account of the forms of freedom centered on agency freedom, in Margaret Archer. And in the remainder of this talk, I will tackle two questions. First, is the focus on student self-formation excessively individualistic? Are we losing sight of the social context and the social effects of higher education? Second, and related to the first question, does the focus on agency and self-formation downplay the importance of structural causes and constraints? Are we losing sight of social inequalities and injustice? Well, first, the individual and the social. Now, this way of posing the problem, the idea that there can be a separation, a conflict, or a tension between the individual and the social, is itself problematic. Confucian thought does not do this. Self-cultivation by the individual is at the practical heart of Confucianism, but self-cultivation focuses on making oneself into a socially appropriate self. Likewise, John Dewey does not do this. Dewey remarks that it's absurd to place individual and society in antithesis. It's like the relationship between the alphabet and the individual letters. You can't have one without the other. Foucault shows in his discussion of self-formation in the ancient West that when we pose a tension between the individual and the social, we are already being excessively individualistic. Foucault traces this separation between the individual and the social to the end of the Roman period and the rise of Christianity. Ancient Rome, the cradle of today's Euro-American West, was not an individualist society. People were enmeshed in a lattice of social hierarchies, ties, roles, and expectations. Foucault grounds the origins of Western individualism in the mental journey that the early Christians made when forming themselves, when they built their identities as Christian selves subordinated to God. In imagining themselves in passage to the better world to come, to the afterlife, they freed themselves from their day-to-day life in time and the world, the social conditions and obligations of life in imperial Rome. In this mental journey, their day-to-day society became externalized, separated from themselves, separated from the self. They came to understand their true selves, their inner selves, as distinct from society, an untrammeled self in passage to eternity, freed of social obligation. The result of this deeply felt, momentous separation was that in Western societies, conformity with the norms of society ceased to be something that was always part of the person, as in the East. Conformity with the social came to be understood as something imposed on people from outside. Foucault says the general form of moral conduct came to take the form of respect for the law, understood as an external authority rather than the work of the self on the self. Self-cultivation as a socially responsible person. Hence, the critique of established morality became couched as an assertion of the importance of the self, the true self, that was separated from that social morality. Now, this triggered a recurring pattern in the West of rebellion against the social order in the name of the essential self, notably in the Renaissance, and again in the Enlightenment and the French and American revolutions, when today's modern Western political cultures took shape. You might say that this rebellion against the social order in the name of the essential self is the high point of Western civilization, those successive transformations, but at the same time, they create this fundamental split between society and the self, which we then have to try to restore when we talk about notions of the common good or the public good. In the period of the French and American revolutions, the emerging polities were shaped, on one hand, by the revolt against post-feudal authority, which was seen as external. In this revolt, demands for political freedom were combined with demands for economic freedom of markets and property. And on the other hand, by the normative primacy of an individual without social obligation. The common good became harder to define in Western societies, which saw themselves as founded on the free consent of autonomous individuals. In a sense, you didn't need society. Liberal theory sees individuals as best determining their own good without external impositions. So in this framework, in this sort of core Western framework, separates the individual and the social, it becomes automatically assumed that if we focus on student self-formation, which is about individuals, we must be turning away from the social. But that's not true. Self-formation is not in itself necessarily individualistic at all, in the sense of separated from society. Individual self-formation can take the form of formation in social values and obligations, amongst other things, in which students are agents of their own socialization, as in Confucian self-cultivation and as in ancient Rome. Or it can be social democratic, in which both the individual and the collective are valued. We can choose how much of the social self we take into the inner private self. But whatever choice we make, whether to conform to society, to adapt, to rebel, to embrace social responsibility, or seek to change the social rules, we are still engaged in a process of self-formation. Now to the other question. Does a focus on agency and self-formation downplay the importance of structural causes and constraints? No, agency is not all-powerful. Social, economic, political, and cultural factors, including the stratifications, inequalities, competition, and closures in higher education, pre-exist agents and are hard to change. Though there are historical moments when larger structural shifts take place and individual and collective agency has greater scope to affect structure. But at all times, the potentials for agency and conscious reflexive self-formation and the scope of the self-forming student to act are influenced by structural factors. People have more freedom than they realise. They can control their responses to structure, and this creates new possibilities, but there's no denying the power of structure. This is not to say structure determines agency. This is a fallacy of much of our theorising in education. The idea that the potentials of student agents, their inner mental lives, are simply programmed by their social origins and the social, racial, and gender hierarchies that confront them. It's almost like a caste system, isn't it? The assumption that people can't escape from their conditions. Agency always has some room to move. My chapter discusses different theorizations of the relation between structure and agency. Confucianism and Bildung, Dewey and C.P. Mead, Vygotsky and Amartya Sen, Giddens, Bourdieu, Emerbauer and Misch, Foucault and Archer. I think that Archer has the relation between structure and agency right. She says that precisely because we have an inner mental life, the double-coded self, the inner conversation between the private self and the social self, agents are ontologically distinct from social structures. Structure and agency are not zero-sum, two parts of a unified whole. They are separated, and they also intersect at many points. Each has its own evolutionary trajectory. Archer says they constitute different levels of a stratified social reality. Both structure and agency are always changing, emergent, and Archer says this means people are not puppets of structures because they have their own emergent properties. Students, like other persons, are capable of resisting, repudiating, suspending, or circumventing structural and cultural tendencies in ways which are unpredictable because of their creative powers as human beings. Agency has an irreducible autonomy. It is both determined and not determined by structure, says Archer. We are simultaneously free and constructed, and we also have some awareness of it. But the scope of our agency freedom is always provisional and highly unequal on the world scale. We should not exaggerate the scope of self-formation as if agents can be wholly separated from their social context, as the early Christians imagined. Nor should we downplay the potentials of agency. How much agents can think and do at a given moment is an empirical question. At Oxford 2 years ago, Mate Bilic, in his master's thesis, investigated the effects of higher education in the political community of the Slovak Republic. He interviewed 14 politicians and political staffers. He found that their potential for self-formation in higher education was determined by the degree of their immersion in higher education, the amount of time and energy they had to fully engage in their education. There were two groups of interviewees. The first group said that higher education had shaped their capabilities, understandings, and outlook, often profoundly. The second group said higher education had few formative effects. The first group had often been deeply engaged in academic learning and in shared political activities and/or cultural experiences while on campus. They had more intensive and diverse relations with faculty and other students. Members of the second group had often studied while working, spent less total time in higher education institutions, and focused largely on just getting the degree. Degree of immersion is a very useful concept for research on self-formation in higher education. Mate developed it as part of his own self-formation, as he remarked when handing in his master's dissertation. We are all continually forming ourselves, and all of us who study higher education can contribute to understanding self-formation. But I'm sure I'm over time and I should stop now.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping on time and very wonderful presentation, very inspiring. So we now hand over to our next presenters, Lili and Soyoung. Like mine, yours must be somewhere else. Maybe that's mine.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Simon and Yusuf. And I'd like to start by thanking Jisun, Monique, and also Yolanda for excellent work in setting up this book talk. And following the excellent presentation by Yusuf and Simon, me and Soyoung, who is joining us online, will talk about our chapter, which employs a cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary approach to explore how students self-develop themselves in higher education. And I would like to highlight cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary here. We all agree that education is culturally bounded. In a meeting earlier this morning, the dean, Professor Yang, was highlighting that a good teaching practice or education practice in London may not be necessarily good in Hong Kong or in Africa or in South East Asia or in to self-develop themselves. At the same time, education research is highly multidisciplinary. We have sociologists, educational researchers, psychologists, and many other researchers from other disciplines looking at similar issues and phenomena in higher education. Then we would like to explore how are these different cultures and different disciplines looking to this key question in higher education. And by doing this, we don't want to develop or derive a universal template that works for all, which is not possible and could be dangerous and reductionist. Rather than that, we are hoping to identify nuances and differences as well as commonalities that we can derive from these different approaches and see how we can understand these different cultural and disciplinary approaches. And in this background, we ask the key question of how do students self-form, transform, and empower themselves in higher education as a result of their interactions with the world. Well, here the world, I think in Simon's presentation, it was more referring to the structure. But here we use the term world, and you see the two essential elements. One is self and one is interaction with the world. The self is, as we have talked about, the shared emphasis on students being their own masters in self-developing in higher education, rather than being the objects and being shaped by the world or by their teachers, peers, or institutions. They have the say and they have agency to make their own decisions. At the same time, students do not self-cultivate, self-form in a vacuum. They constantly interact with the world. And in this context, how we view the world, particularly the relationship between I and the world, will matter much in terms of how we develop ourselves. And underlying this, we have this assumption that the worldview is essential for all human beings in terms of our own development and our behaviors. And then we ask this question in philosophical, cultural philosophies and different disciplinary studies. And I would like to start by introducing the cultural philosophies and then hand it over to Soyoung to talk about disciplinary studies. Well, the cultural philosophies we are talking about here includes three ones. And of course, we know there are many more, but here we primarily look into these three, which are influential in different parts of the world. The first one is a more sort of Anglo-Saxon dualistic I-world concept, idealistic understanding that assumes the world as composed of I and non-I, and there is constant tensions between the I and non-I, and there is assumption that the non-I or the other may constrain the freedom, the space of freedom of I. So the individual development of self-formation highlights the expansion of the space for freedom, agency freedom, and the improvement of the capacity for reasoning. And there is also an emphasis on the cultivation of public spiritedness, which, however, has not been as much emphasized as at least this Confucian harmonious I world concept. Whereas where the individuals are not really transcendental individual self, instead they are role-bearing persons. We cannot isolate any person from their communities, and they always bear certain roles. So the self-cultivation of persons in this sort of I world concept highlights the harmonization, the intra-person harmonization in terms of their emotions, their mental thoughts, the harmonization within the person, as well as the harmonization of the world, and the harmonization of the intra-harmonization process and the harmonization of the world process. So there is a lot of emphasis on harmonization of the person themselves and also the different kinds of communities and collective entities. And this one is Islamic Sunni understanding, which emphasizes that individuals have agency freedom. However, the agency freedom is bounded in the possibles, the spheres of possibles for I, which is set up by God. That said, individuals do not know that sphere of society. That's why we're calling it virtuous I world concept. Even though this virtuous element is also shared emphasized in the Confucian one, maybe somehow in that one less so. And then what do we get from these different cultural philosophies? We don't have time to dig into that, but I would like to highlight 3 elements that are shared emphasized in these different cultural philosophies, even though how they approach to them varies. The first one is all of them emphasize and acknowledge agency, even though the scope of agency varies. Like the dualistic worldview, the self, they have absolute freedom, and it's important to protect the space of freedom, whereas the other two, they acknowledge there is a scope, there is constraints and limitation of the space for freedom of agency. And the second one, they all emphasize the importance of exercising agency in their interaction with the world and also in developing themselves. They are their own masters, make their own decisions by exercising agency. And the third one is they acknowledge the possibility to, and also the process of enhancing agency through interacting with the world, even though how that agency is exercised, enhanced, might be different, and they put different emphasis on either like virtuous development or that capacity for reasoning or the harmonization of the becoming a virtuous person, moral person. And it's important that higher education plays an important role in supporting students' enhancement of their agency. I know up to now it still feels quite abstract because these cultural philosophies do not provide detailed approaches or discussions of how these different elements, 3 elements, can help us understand student self-development. So we will invite Soyoung to talk about how these different disciplines, their studies, approach to these 3 elements, which will shed more light on it and give more details about this. Soyoung, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lili. I hope everyone can hear me very well. And then let me please take over from here and continue our presentation. Lili has spoken about how the different I-world relationships similarly point to the acknowledgement, enactment, and enhancement of agency. As Lili said, I'm going to try give some details and supporting ideas and vivid image about these 3 topics of student agency in higher education. By focusing on these 3 topics, the presentation will now move on to the discussion of how these topics are researched in the literature. And then while Lili draws on multiple cultural perspectives, I will engage with divergent disciplinary points of view, particularly in psychological, sociological, and educational studies. As shown in the slide, the book has continuously argued for more attention to student agency in higher education research, criticizing that major higher education policies and discourses have often neglected student agency. In contrast, in other fields, human agency tends to be widely recognized. In various social theories, for example, agency is acknowledged as an element of society, as Simon has already talked about during his presentation, and their discussions of agency has almost always coupled with structure. Higher education researchers adopt a diverse configuration of agency and structure suggested in the theories, and which determines how much agency can be empowered in interaction with structure. Meanwhile, the analysis of agency proposed by Emirbai and Nish and their concept of temporal orientations of agency has more directly influenced the conception of student agency in higher education, particularly. For example, BSI and Tez's idea of student agency in relation to education, and more recent theorization of student agency in higher education by Manya Klementsik have also drawn on this idea of temporal orientation of agency. As Manya Klementsik acknowledged, human agency is not only discussed in sociology, but also widely recognized in psychological research. Psychologists rather focus on human agency as an explanatory factor of human motivations and actions, while sociologists focus more on explaining how society is constructed in relation to structure and agency relationship. Two exemplary concepts discussed in this chapter are self-efficacy and self-determination, although these two are not the only psychological concepts that drew on the idea of human agency. Self-efficacy refers to one's beliefs about their own capacity to take actions to achieve desirable results, which is proposed to be a foundation of human agency by Albert Bandura. Self-determination, on the other hand, is premised on the assumption that humans are active agents whose behaviors do not have to be stimulated by external regulations, but can be initiated by their innate desires, such as intrinsic motivations, such as joy, interest. Since these concepts are part of ground theories, which means that they are not confined to explaining a specific population, so specific phenomena, researchers use these concepts as an independent or dependent variable for successful student outcomes in higher education, that you might easily find in the literature. And then can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Moving on now, let me introduce some examples of how student agency is practiced in higher education. There are findings about various occasions where student agency is activated, rendering higher education as student self-formation. One of the most observable agency exercise in higher education is found in the thick literature on student learning as an important precondition for successful learning outcomes. Concepts such as self-regulated learning and deep-registered learning, or even student engagement, all implicitly link successful and more desirable learning to active agency manifested in processing knowledge. Although they do not necessarily use the word student agency. Not only the academic level, student agency is also enacted on the social level, as acknowledged in the different philosophical ideas and social imaginaries, as Lili introduced. Indeed, student agency is exercised for reforming institutional policies or improving institutional practices, and for broader social changes through student activism. Even when researching student learning, some researchers included the idea of engagement with knowledge, specific disciplinary knowledge, and their discussion expands the scope of student agency from processing given information to interacting with the wider society. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then how is student agency enhanced or restricted in higher education? Two approaches frequently appear in the discussion of the development of student agency. They are namely, first, the enablement of student agency by controlling environment, and second, the development of the agency capacity through various measures that I will introduce in this slide. So first, scholars have researched what kind of learning environment affords more empowered learner agency. To name a few examples, manageable workload, clear course objectives, and contingent assessment were found to enhance students' perceived control over their own learning processes, which indicates agency. Psychologists have also emphasized the role of affordable environment for student agency. For example, self-determination theory that I've introduced earlier suggests that intrinsic motivation can only be maintained and activated when universities support students to feel more included, competent, and autonomous, which Ryan and Zizi introduced as a basic psychological need. Second, regarding developing agency capacities, Biesta and Teta suggest that changing one's agency orientation towards structure through biological learning in adult education can develop agency, can develop student human agency and change the agentic orientation. Also, the capability approaches point out the power of university level specialized knowledge in securing individual freedom to be and to do as they desire and live as they value. Another key measure that I'd like to point out here is international student mobility, a quintessential example of how higher education can provide social cultural resources to develop student agency, as it has been discussed widely as a major resource for student self-formation. Then, finally, to the conclusion in the next slide, thank you. In this presentation, we have identified 3 elements from 3 cultural philosophies, which indicate the essentialness of agency in student formation and development. The acknowledgement, enactment, exercise, and enhancement of student agency were elaborated and supported by detailed examples from educational, sociological, and psychological research. By suggesting higher education as a platform for enhancing or restraining student agency, I believe that our chapter calls for revisiting the current practices and discourses of higher education as an alternative perspective. Although remaining at the conceptual level, our chapter can contribute to providing the philosophical groundwork for placing student agency at the heart of higher education, which can also strengthen the research program of self-formation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I delivered everything that we discussed in our chapter, and yeah, thank you.
So may I just add one more critical reflection on the chapter is that which I should have mentioned in the beginning, that while we are looking into the different disciplinary research, we realize that most of the disciplinary research, they still follow the Anglo-Saxon way of work cultural philosophy rather than the other two. So there is the need that we incorporate those different cultural philosophies in guiding and also foregrounding for more empirical research into this topic. Thank you. This may be for Ken, that is.
Well, thank you so much for 4 speakers. I know it's not easy to coordinate this hybrid, 2 in online and 2 speakers in offline, but 4 of you coordinated perfectly in terms of timing and also presentation. So thank you so much. Now I open the floor for the Q&A and any questions and comments. For the online participant, feel free to ask any questions, comments in the chat. I will invite you to ask any questions. And I give a chance first to the participant in the room. Any questions and comments from this seminar room? Yes, Professor Ming Cheng. I give you mic.
I must say this is so enlightening. I think this is a few issues come to my mind. Now, one is the self-society issue is such a critical issue in Chinese society and Chinese societies around the world. And in the past 50, 60 years,
Sorry,
Sense.
Professor, just 1 second.
okay.
Yeah, I don't think online participants, they can't hear.
They cannot hear anything from that right now?
Should I use the mic?
Maybe this one, to see,
Did they hear Lily's remarks?
maybe they didn't.
I can see them. I can see that.
I'll repeat. Can you hear, Simon?
Yes, now, yes.
Thank you. I was saying that this is so enlightening because here's a point, a few critical issues that's been on my mind and I was struggling. The first is in the past 60, 50 years, this is such a critical issue. The relationship between self and society is fundamental to China, Chinese society, and Chinese societies around the world. It went from one extreme to the other until the Cultural Revolution. It was almost totally society over self. And then in the simple 30, 40 years of open door policy, it's almost the other side. But now there's a lack of statement of what is it, self and society is one issue. The second issue, I think this is fundamental to the now US-China dichotomy. Cultural value means that it is taken for granted. Values within a culture is never questioned within the culture. It's only when you compare, you know the difference between cultures. And on that point, I have to thank Yusuf because I was just back yesterday from Morocco, which is 99% Sunni. And it's a totally, I was there for 2 weeks. We went from, we went to the Medinas instead of the shopping malls. And we went to the, anyway, it's such a culture that I don't understand. So it moved this, I want to read the book more to move me away from the simple dichotomy between Western and Chinese culture. This whole spectrum of cultures around the world. One thing I have to read into the book to understand more is about knowledge. Is agency and self-formation all about knowledge? Of course, it depends on how you define knowledge. In some cultures, they may say that everything is about knowledge. But in some cultures, knowledge is what you understand. But beyond knowledge is how you, the value system between for yourself. For example, you will see the 21st century competencies in the US and the 21st century skills in the US and the 21st century competencies in Singapore. The difference is that in the US, it's basically about knowledge and skills. But in the Singapore framework, although knowledge and skills are more or less the same, but they are core values and purpose of 4 kinds of people. So people and values are essential to the Singapore framework, which is not there in the American framework. Now, to the extreme, I might be a little bit too cynical. In the US framework, if a person has all these 21st century skills, he or she could still be a very bad person. Could be hurting the society. It's not included. No, I'm not trying to go over this cynicism, but it's very enlightening. I must buy the book immediately online. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Any response from the authors?
So maybe to this question, any of our contributors can respond, but maybe I'll start a bit more. And then, okay, Simon wants to respond, and maybe Soyoung may also want to. I mean, let me just come back on the first part of the comment about this, So in the literature, we've been discussing West, and everything was West-centric. I think there's nothing wrong. We have to learn that civilization as well, but everyone is doing it anyway. So we need to learn more about East, right? But East also is now researched, and it's very important. We have to learn more. And I think he is right in the sense that we have to maybe diversify and we have to learn the other civilizations as well in a comparative sense. And without maybe comparing them, we don't know. I'm coming from Turkey, I mean, primarily Muslim country, but also very secular country. I think there are variations within the countries as well. I think there needs to be more work on this. I have to acknowledge we haven't done a lot on this now in this book, but we highlighted some important points on it. And hopefully I made a new application, a grant application on this. I hope I can get it and we will work on this more. And thank you for highlighting the importance of it again. And the second aspect, self-formation and its relationship to knowledge. Is it only about knowledge? I mean, there could be different perspectives on this, and I would like to highlight my colleague. My chapter itself, for example, argues that it goes beyond what's happening in the four walls of the classroom, basically. But let's hear maybe who wants to go first, Simon or Soyoung? Maybe Simon first then on this topic, and what do you think?
I think this Kaiming who asked the question. It's a bit hard to see from here. I really appreciate the extended discussion and statement in the question, if you like. I just want to comment on 2 points. I mean, one is the point about the spectrum of cultures, and the other is the point about self and society. I mean, of course, there's such a rich range of core civilizational ideas out there, aren't there? Iranian Persian civilization has 2,000, 3,000 year, history. Latin America is developing very distinctive social and cultural forms. Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, and West Asia. Islamic countries, so-called, because as Yusuf said, they're very variant in some ways. And in Southeast Asia, you've got Islam and also other countries as well. I think India is going to be enormously important to us long term because it's such a reservoir of culture. So it's diverse but deep, and becoming, I think, it's more apparent what's there in India historically, which was suppressed by colonialism. Colonialism set out, especially British colonialism in India, set out to eliminate indigenous education, scholarship, so well developed in India. But it's springing back in some areas, and there'll be new hybrid Western stroke India forms as well. But I do think the relationship between Eastern and Western civilizations is an important point, is an important nexus. And I say that because I think the at this point of time, and it won't always be the case, but at this point of time, the university and higher education are highly developed in Euro-America and highly developed in East Asia in their modern form. And in the case of Chinese civilization, of course, very deep roots underneath the modern form of higher education, which has been so Western influenced, but yet, as Yang reminds us frequently, there is still that residual Chinese civilizational character, and it will become more important. And I do think the encounter and the exchange between these very different civilizational zones is very strategic at this point and worth discussing. On the self and society, I mean, and to take the East-West point further, I think that our way forward might lie in a combination of a sort of humanistic Western valuation of the individual, not as separate from society, but worthwhile in itself, and on the other hand, a sort of Chinese civilizational recognition of the importance of social order and harmony, and of the social responsibility of persons. I think we can combine these two. They're not necessarily in antithesis. If we can, nor is the individual and society necessarily zero sum or in antithesis. If we can combine these two things, and I think we can move forward. And the state has a crucial role because the state becomes the point where we nurture the individual in a socially responsible way, so that one of the responsibilities of the state in education seems to me is not to say to the individual, your fate is now in your own hands, you've got to manage your future. It's to nurture the capabilities and the scope for autonomy of the person. And education has a really key role in this. And I think this is consistent with what Soyoung was saying as well, that the role of the state and of educational institutions is to nurture that capability, that capacity, that space for self-formation, but it can do so in a socially responsible way. It doesn't have to do so by absenting the question of society and social relations.
Thank you, Simon. Soyoung, would you like to add or?
Yeah, briefly, thank you so much for your question. And I echo Simon's and Lili, no, not Lili, Yusuf's response, but I wanted to briefly add about your point about the dichotomy between Western and Chinese cultural ideas, because I'm from South Korea, and I also find that my research on South Korean students also find that some findings cannot be homogenized or cannot be reduced to Chinese model because Korea is Asian and Eastern country. But I also find that this comparison between these two big cultural ideas can be helpful to navigate my research on Korean culture. So I think this comparative knowledge can also produce comparative value that I can refer to as a researcher who studies Korean culture. And also about your point about the knowledge in related to education and self-formation, I agree that knowledge is not only taught that self-formation can occur or can be stimulated or student agency is activated only by knowledge. I don't think so. But as Simon said, I believe that knowledge is what makes higher education distinctive as a distinctive place or platform for self-formation. And I'm repeating Simon. Knowledge, I believe, that is a mediator that can link students as an academic learner in higher education and also social actors outside of higher education. And my research on Korean students also found that echoed what you just said about the cultural differences in the meaning of knowledge. And then I traced Korean students' accounts of learning and Korean students' accounts of knowledge throughout their studies. And I found that I meant knowledge in my study as the disciplinary knowledge, the subject knowledge that they study in higher education, like educational studies and philosophy, physics, and that Korean students had attached very similar values and meanings and accounts about learning, but their accounts of disciplinary knowledge changed a lot throughout their studies. So that was one of my findings that, oh, okay, there must be some cultural value that has strongly a cultural value strongly attached to the meaning of learning or cultural meaning of learning, as you said, like cultural meaning of knowledge. But maybe students develop some specific understanding and account of knowledge as they engage with knowledge and immerse themselves in academic setting in higher education. So yeah, thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Soyoung. Maybe I add one more point, which is related to the critical reflection I shared at the end of the presentation, which might not have been, which our online participants may have heard it because of the mic issue. So I was sharing in the end that in the end we found all of those, the majority of those disciplinary research were primarily grounded in those in the Anglo-Saxon worldview, world concept rather than other cultural philosophies. And I'm thinking how we may move things forward. I think people here and also online agree that culture matters, and we are all talking about how we move things forward in terms of the limitations of both different sides For example, the overemphasis on the individual's transcendental self, and also the potential of losing the importance of self in the Chinese cultural philosophy. Then how might we infuse those cultural differences, lenses into our research, like empirical studies on student agency? For example, what is agency? Would agency differ across cultures? Would people use different words for that? And would it matters in terms of the way how we learn? Because that refers to the knowledge. How do we define knowledge? Is it broadly or narrowly defined? And what is? I was talking to a colleague on Chinese philosophy the other day, talking about what is logic. If, for example, the Chan Buddhist way of doing logic, is it considered as the concrete way of doing logic in the contemporary definition of logic? And how do we define knowledge? Is certain kinds of knowledge and arguments not grounded in reasoning considered as knowledge, and so forth? So just a provocative thought that how we infuse those cultural lenses and differences, nuances into our research design, and the next step is something that we may talk further and think about in the future.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Do we have more questions and comments from the participants in the room and also online? From online. Professor Zhang, are you there? Would you like to speak?
Hello?
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for posting the comment. Would you like to speak for the audience here today?
I would just like to add one more concept that I think is quite relevant to everything that has been said, which has been important, fascinating. But it's a memory of a conversation I had many years ago now with a young Spanish researcher who I was working with at the time, when one day she very seriously explained to me the importance of learning when and how to tell lies. And I've always remembered that. I've often thought it should be in the school curriculum that this was such an important process. And it relates to the comment that I've put in the chat about identity and who we are. And therefore, what I say to you this morning might be very different, from what I say to people that I meet this afternoon. But the questions of identity and of lying seem to me to be very important educationally, socially, and psychologically. So I think that would be my recommendation. Let's focus on telling lies.
Thank you, Professor. The speakers, would you like to respond briefly? Okay, sure.
John, hi, how are you? Look, I know that I'm probably obsessed by the late Foucault at the moment, and it's all I ever talk about. But I mean, there's a really interesting discussion in that work on parasia, the concept of parasia in Greece and Rome, and this is the notion of truth telling. Of that recognizing, respecting the fact that truth telling is actually difficult, challenging, and a person who's a truth teller and can be trusted to be authentic and to tell the truth as well as they are able is an extremely valuable resource for everyone. And that when we develop ourselves, one of the ways we develop ourselves is with a counselor, a friend, a significant other who has parasia, who has this role of telling us the truth about ourselves. And that's one of the things that a really good teacher can do. Or you might say a good doctoral supervisor can do, is help the student by telling the truth. And isn't that function of telling the truth so important now, because public discourse is depraved? I mean, it's been depraved by social media emotionalism, whereby people just express their feelings and define themselves as different to each other and so on. And that's a real syndrome now, and that's dominating social media discourse. And it's also depraved, probably more fundamentally, by commercialism, so that whenever people speak to others, they're trying to sell something, they're trying to trick them into believing something that's not true. So for economic reasons, they're hiding things from other people and so on. So, and that's one of our biggest problems, because we see public life and politics now in the same terms that, people are always selling something, that they're not to be trusted and so on. So parasia, this function of telling the truth, extraordinarily valuable. And this is why academic life and education in general are really worthwhile, because they are places where we say you should tell the truth, and your responsibility is to tell society the truth about science or about society or about culture. That's your job, is to get it right, to be as clear-minded as you can, dispassionate in presenting people with the reality of the world. That's our job. And I think that's a great quest and a great vocation, and I really honor it. I think that telling the truth is a really valuable thing to do. So I would say we probably need to focus on that rather than learning how to tell lies better, because an awful lot of other people are telling lies very well already.
Would you like to move on? Okay, thank you. We have one more question from the audience, a single line participant. Tang-un, would you like to speak? Yes, maybe he or she is not going to speak. I will.
In the library, you can't talk. Yes.
I know. Yeah. Good. Any speakers?
I was thinking that Simon might want to get started, but if you want me to start, because I don't know, this is such a big question, as you have already realized the logic for culture, and I am still struggling with how do we understand the logic of culture? Are we referring to how to use or research culture in our research on the topic, or are we trying to make culture as an object of research to understand how culture works? I think these two may lead to different everyone, as someone was mentioned, yeah, someone was mentioning that we are all born within a pre-given society, that the previous language, the previous structure, knowledge will influence us, maybe not shape us, but our existence is conditioned in that condition in terms of the knowledge, culture, and everything. So every time we think, the things we see in terms of the horizon that we see things are sort of largely influenced by the culture. So in that sense, we need to be aware of this cultural horizon and the conditioning we are in, and to try to be open-minded to move beyond that conditioning and horizon, try to see it or interact with people with a different cultural horizon or conditioning, and to interact. And I think that's probably the only or the most effective way of getting more aware of our own cultural conditioning and horizon, and then to extend that, try to have an infusion of horizons in Gadamer sense. And I think that is also the purpose of doing this comparison of cultural approaches to different practice and ideas on certain topics. And I think that's one of the most important rationales for studying culture in our research and also paying attention to culture, also trying to get to understand ourselves and to research other things. It's my initial thoughts. Simon, you want to, yeah.
Well, this topic could go on all day, but I mean, the problem with the word culture is it's so enormous and everything's in it, like society, you know, it's what's the logic of society? There's an even bigger concept, which is called nature or ecology, where all the human stuff is only one part of it, and you know, society and culture are only one part of it. And there's the biosphere, the geology of the universe as well. So, I mean, all these concepts are really hard to deal with, and you know, people devote their entire lives to trying to reduce them to something manageable. I think with culture, it doesn't have a logic is the answer. I mean, logic implies that you know, it's a sort of bounded problem, you know, a sort of structure that within which you can get a pattern or an order. So you can have a I think a logic of, say, rates of return to graduate degrees, because you can collect the data on what people earn and what they paid for at the time they were enrolled in their education, and look at the lifetime earnings and so on. But there's a whole lot of other things going on, aren't there? Larger contextual things happening that are affecting their earnings as well as their education, and also things that are important to them other than their earnings. So culture's not a single a bounded, ordered pattern thing. It's sort of human behavior, and you know, the contents of discourse, and the forms of arts and science that we use, and above all, probably about language and about relations through language. So it's just too big a thing to have a logic to. But I think I agree with what Lili said, and I think that it's really useful for us to discuss interculturality and cultural multiplicity at this point of time, and how in which different cultures might come together in a harmonious way, but a way which also respects diversity and values diversity, and where we learn from the other.
Professor Cheng.
I started my university education in mathematics, so I started with logic. When I teach culture, I never thought of logic applying to culture, because I don't think they belong to the same category. That's it. So I always feel illiterate when I hear this question.
Well, we are almost running out of time, but I have one final question from the online participant. So can I invite Amy? Amy, are you there? Right.
Yeah.
I can read the question for you if you're not
Yeah,
able
hi.
to speak. Oh, hi, Amy.
Yeah,
Would you
hi.
like to speak? Yes, please.
Yeah, I do have a question. I think this topic is quite interesting. And then I'm thinking about the different people. So it seems like, you know, if I try to apply this concept to understand the learner agency of the secondary school children, and the case might be quite different from the university students, because from your talk and my understanding is that the university students are more likely to be impacted by the stratified social reality, and rather than the instructional context, like their immediate learning in the classroom. Yeah, however, I mean, for the secondary school students, they are more likely seems to be their agency to be influenced by the teacher's instruction. For instance, like the student-centered or like the teacher-centered instructions will more likely to impact them. So yeah, I wonder, I mean, what is your perception about this kind of applying this concept and for the different groups of learners? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm happy to say something if that's okay. Look, I agree with the point. I think I think at university stage people have more scope to choose their pathway, and you know, which subjects they do. In some programs there's quite a lot of scope. In others it's more constrained. But they choose which pathway to go into, whereas at school your curriculum is more or less set until late in secondary. And I guess at higher education stage, students are expected to take more responsibility for their own learning. They're not sat on as heavily as they are at school. and so on. So, but I think at all levels of education, social stratification, the sort of stratified character of structural impact and effects plays a huge role in our lives, and that's true of young people. It's true of your social background, your family origins, and so on. Never stop being important, and certainly when we're all conscious of the fact that we resemble our parents in some respects, and as you go into the workforce after graduating, those networks that you have, which are partly personal networks and family networks, become pretty important again. So social background really does matter, but education does have some scope to add value and to give people more options than their social background would have given them otherwise. And one of the most important ways that education does that is by fostering the capability of personal agency.
Thank you a lot for your explanation. So can I understand in that way? So if we will try to understand the interaction between learner agency and their context, and it's when we see the context, it might be better to maybe to see it from different layers, like the macro, the society, and also like the family, and also like their immediate their context, something like that.
I think so, and even their peer group matters too. That is often the way that social values are expressed, is through their peer groups, even more than their teachers.
Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Anyone else wants to respond? I saw Soyoung may wanted to, but no pressure. Because I guess you.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond? No pressure.
Yeah, I wanted to, but Simon.
Okay, please go ahead. So I just didn't want to miss your response.
Go ahead.
Oh, me, okay. Well, I mean, okay, I thought you wanted to respond, okay. So I fully agree with the discussion just said, and it may be in the sense of, can we also apply this in primary schools, etc. I think, at least my perspective on it is that, self-formation and agency, these require some level of self-autonomy, some reflective agency. And I think at the maybe primary education level, maybe early secondary education before university, these traits, in my perspective, do not develop fully. We see them very strongly in the higher education. That's my perspective. But given that, we can still, we don't need to position any kind of education at any level in a passive receiving way, right? We can start from that as, for example, constructivist approach kind of is relevant to this in that they let the learner to construct their knowledge. So in my perspective, self-formation fully is possible when the self is fully autonomous and has full reflexive agency. But this doesn't mean at the earlier levels, like primary education, etc., we should just develop a passive receiving students. That's not a good idea anyway, because they will move towards higher education and then be responsible students in their societies, their citizens. Anyone else who wants to contribute more? Soyoung, feel free if you want to add anything, or else I will give it back to our colleague Jisun. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for everyone to stay with us for like 1.5 hours, for the 4 speakers, for wonderful presentation, and also audience giving all these questions and comments. Thank you so much. Now we know what to do. You go and buy the book and download the book and read the book and have a better understanding about the full text. That's what we all should do right after this seminar. Thank you so much, everybody. The CHERA is organizing upcoming seminars. As you can see in the chat, we have a coming seminar next week about artificial intelligence in higher education. We also have a research master students here. They will have a Thank you everybody for joining us today, especially 4 speakers. Congratulations again for the book. And then, well, thank you again and see you next seminar. Bye everyone. Bye-bye.